If we were closer to home, I would lock you up and turn you over to my authorities for trial. But I don't even have that ability here. And I am not prepared to carry you forever in our brig. So I see no other alternative. But to let you go.
The original series doesn't engage too often with the motif of honor before reason, but it is very common in the Next Generation and Voyager. To be more precise, Picard and Janeway constantly put Federation values above the welfare of their own crew, and at times, risk the security of the entire Federation. Even one of the writers, Herb Wright, indirectly acknowledged the issue. Quote, "I wrote a thing where we were fired upon by the Ferengi, and I had us firing back a warning shot to slow them down because we were in chase. Gene ripped that out, saying that we weren't allowed to fire back. He said we wouldn't do that. I said, Gene, it's an act of war. They've fired at us and they've stolen something of ours." And Gene supposedly fired back, "We wouldn't do that. That's stupid." Unquote. In Galaxy's Child, the Enterprise spots a space-dwelling organism and proceeds to observe it. After some time, the creature mistakes the vessel for a threat and attacks. The crew attempts to use their phaser cannons at minimal power to repel the attack without harming the being. However, their attempts at non-lethal measures fail and the organism is killed. Picard is mortified. He sits motionless in his chair for some time before relinquishing command to Riker and then retreats to his ready room.
We're out here to explore, to make contact with other life forms, to establish peaceful relations, but not to interfere. And absolutely not to destroy. And yet, look at what we have just done.
Captain, everything you did was consistent with established Starfleet procedures.
Later, the crew notices what appear to be residual life signs, but they belong to the creature's unborn fetus. Naturally, the Enterprise decides to help birth the baby from a sense of guilt for having defended themselves. The baby is able to leave the mother's corpse, but attaches itself to the ship's hull and begins feeding on its energy. Counselor Troy concludes that the baby thinks that the Enterprise is its mother. The feeding, however, runs the risk of destroying the ship. Picard naturally refuses to act, again out of a sense of guilt for having killed the baby's mother, and because technically the baby has no violent intentions. At least, that's what's stated. However, considering this is the first time the crew has ever encountered this species, for all they know, the baby could have a clear understanding that they killed its mother and is now attempting to destroy them in retaliation. Again, this is not what the episode conveys, but I feel it necessary to highlight here that the crew makes many assumptions about hostile behaviors in virtually all their life and death struggles. The crew has to do something though, so they come up with the idea to make the ship's energy unpalatable to the baby. The analogy used is sour milk. This works and causes the newborn to detach itself. Conveniently, this occurs right as they discover its larger herd. The baby flies off to be with its own kind, and everyone lives happily ever after. The end. Now, I'm not condemning the act of saving a baby animal, or being hesitant to use violence when there are other options, or exercising a profound respect for wildlife. These things are all well and good, but Star Trek creates a patterned behavior that occurs in excess to the point where it becomes rather unreasonable. Over time, the franchise may have created a cultural mindset in the audience that eschewed self-preservation in favor of pathological altruism. The fact is, the situation could have easily ended with the Enterprise destroyed, either by the baby's power drain, or the herd could have once again misconstrued the vessel as a threat. Picard has his entire crew of men, women, and children to think about. Yes, there is in fact an entire preschool on board the Enterprise. Picard takes risks not only with his own life, but with that of his crew and their children, and he does so to satisfy an increasingly misguided morality. In the episode Evolution, Wesley Crusher's science experiment results in the creation of sentient nanobots that invade the ship's computer core and begin to cause cascading system failures. However, a scientist aboard the vessel denies their sentience. Notably, he proclaims, quote, "You can't have a civilization of computer chips. They're made in a plant in Dakar, Senegal. I've watched the construction," unquote. This is a progressive assertion of equality that one day advanced computer chips will be manufactured in West Africa. But I digress. The scientist demands that the nanites, as they're called, be destroyed to protect the crew and his experiments. Picard, however, insists that they cannot destroy something that may or may not be sentient.
I cannot exterminate something that may or may not be intelligent.
My good captain.
The disgruntled scientist takes matters into his own hands and, against Picard's orders, attempts to destroy the creatures by flooding one of the compartments they inhabit with high-level gamma radiation. This doesn't kill them all, however, and those that remain retaliate by flooding the ship with noxious gas. Riker saves the crew temporarily by engaging manual control over certain systems. Data reports that all the nanites in the upper core are in fact dead, but many remain throughout the ship. The scientist asserts that Picard has no choice but to act now and must destroy the rest of the creatures. Picard responds, quote, "If any man, woman, or child on this ship is harmed as a result of your experiment, I will have your head before the highest command in the Federation," unquote. This is rather interesting because, again, Picard's own actions have constantly put the women and children aboard the Enterprise at risk. If anyone should be prosecuted here, perhaps it's Picard. The scientist then exclaims, quote, "Good Lord, you are talking about machines with a screw loose. Simply turn them off and be done with them," unquote. Data then interjects in what is a typical act of moral demagoguery on his part, and he proclaims that the scientist's own actions have inadvertently proven that the nanites do have a collective intelligence. I'll speak more on Data's moral posturing in the upcoming section entitled The Moralizing Outsiders, but whether or not the nanites are intelligent is largely beside the point. Even before the scientist directly assaulted them, they were already destroying the ship, albeit with less haste and calculation. It stands to reason that if they were smart enough to know that the ship's occupants were susceptible to noxious gases, they were smart enough to realize that their previous actions were damaging the ship. From here, the nanites attempt to attack and kill the disgruntled scientist who acted against them, and he is depicted rather cowardly in response, begging Picard to save him from the creatures. The crew is about to concede to the scientist's way of thinking when Data suggests that the beings are learning to communicate. Data then acts as an intermediary to negotiate a peaceful settlement. He does this by allowing the nanites to penetrate his own neural circuitry. This seems somewhat symbolic, as if to say that you should open yourself in a literal sense to potential threats. However, the nanites could have easily decided to make him explode, or, considering the myriad ways in which Data is hijacked throughout the series, they could have used him as a puppet to murder the rest of the crew. Data's leap of faith here is portrayed as noble, when in fact it's reckless and stupid. Of course, it turns out that the nanites are entirely reasonable beings. There's even a scene where the disgruntled scientist has to grovel before them and ask for forgiveness.
I am the one responsible for the deaths in the computer core.
We know who you are.
I deeply regret the incident.
The nanites are then relocated to an uninhabited planet to build their own society. Again, this is always how these situations work out. The perceived enemy is the reasonable and understanding one, while it's humanity's aggressive and impatient behavior that puts us all at risk. The Voyager episode Nemesis plays more directly on this particular motif. Chakotay is stranded on a planet and is recruited by the Vori to resist a genocide on the part of grotesque-looking monsters called the Kraden. Chakotay ends up at a camp of nice-looking and friendly white people. The monsters then attack and start hauling off the elderly to a death camp. They tie Chakotay to the ground and leave him for dead. Then he is rescued by one of his new Vori comrades, and the two go off to engage in a battle against the monsters. Suddenly, one of the monsters speaks with Tuvok's voice. He explains that Chakotay was brainwashed by the Vori to fight in a war against the Kraden, who are actually rather sensible beings who contacted Voyager about Chakotay's whereabouts. Over the course of the conversation, Tuvok's true likeness is revealed as his monster appearance slowly fades away. It turns out that the Vori had put Chakotay through a simulation using holographic projections. Tuvok takes Chakotay back to the Vori village that was attacked, and all the people whom Chakotay had seen massacred were there once again. They even come up to him and repeat the same lines they had uttered when they met him the first time. The motif, again, is that the people you think are the bad guys are actually the good guys, and vice versa.
I wish it were as easy to stop hating as it was to start.
In the episode Elogium, the Voyager crew spots another space creature, and soon after, they are sucked into an entire herd of them. Many of the animals begin attaching themselves to the ship's hull. Indeed, for some reason, the writers were rather keen on this idea. This time, though, the creatures think the ship is a potential mate. One of the bigger animals, presumably some kind of alpha, then begins attacking Voyager with plasma blasts. B'Elanna says that, quote, "A plasma blast is a hostile move. Shouldn't we be thinking about responding?" unquote. Janeway, of course, rebuts this with, quote, "If the creature threatens serious damage to the ship, I'll consider it an enemy. Until then, they're all to be treated as indigenous life forms behaving normally in their natural habitat," unquote. Tuvok and the rest of the crew repeatedly convey their concerns that the ship is going to be destroyed and that force would be the appropriate response here. Janeway continues to refuse, however. Eventually, Chakotay posits that, quote, "The creature is responding to us as a sexual rival. We might try behaving in a submissive way. That may appease him. We'd be acknowledging that he's dominant and that we're no match for him," unquote. So from here, Voyager simulates a series of flashing colored lights and physical maneuvers to demonstrate their submission to the alien. Naturally, this works, and the audience is perhaps left with the impression that responding with submission to hostile aliens is the morally correct action. Perhaps it should be noted here that Janeway's moral framework doesn't even protect the pseudo-immigrants into her culture. In Season 1, Neelix joins and assists Janeway and her crew, who are stranded in his section of the galaxy. Together they encounter the Vidians, who are afflicted with a disease called the phage, which destroys their bodies. To survive, they're forced to steal organs from other races. In this case, they steal Neelix's lungs and leave him to die. Luckily, the holographic doctor is able to produce a set of holographic lungs as a stopgap, until Neelix's real lungs can be recovered. But when Janeway finally catches the thieves, they explain that his lungs have already been grafted onto another Vidian, and that if they were removed, it would kill the Vidian. Now, one might expect Janeway to take the side of Neelix, a man who has sworn his loyalty to her and has in fact helped the crew survive on numerous occasions, but in fact, she takes pity on the Vidians, as she states, quote, "I can't begin to understand what your people have gone through. They may have found a way to ignore the moral implications of what you are doing, but I have no such luxury. I don't have the freedom to kill you to save another. My culture finds that to be a reprehensible and entirely unacceptable act. If we were closer to home, I would lock you up and turn you over to my authorities for trial. But I don't even have that ability here, and I am not prepared to carry you forever in our brig, so I see no other alternative but to let you go," unquote. This is remarkable. Considering the extenuating circumstances, which Janeway herself outlines, it would have been entirely reasonable for her to summarily execute the Vidians and retrieve Neelix's lungs. Instead, Janeway allows members of her crew to be abused in a rather vile manner so that she can maintain perceived moral purity. Of course, the writers have the Vidians reciprocate Janeway's goodwill. They respond to her gesture by helping the holographic doctor transplant a lung from another crew member into Neelix. Ironically, it's another pseudo-immigrant, Kes, who donates the lung. So now, 2 of Janeway's crew members, both pseudo-immigrants, have been mutilated to satisfy her morality. Again, the Vidians were willing to kill to protect one of their own, whereas Janeway was willing to let her people die to keep her sense of morality intact. Now, there are several other examples of this, but the absolute height of insanity can be seen in the episode Silicon Avatar. The Enterprise crew is assisting the establishment of a human colony on the planet Melona 4. A storm ensues and a giant flying crystalline entity begins killing indiscriminately and destroying everything in its path. The crew had already learned of the crystalline entity before in the episode Data Lore. This was when the Enterprise explored Data's origins on Omicron Theta, where he had first been found and activated by Starfleet. There, it is learned that the same crystalline entity had wiped out all life on Omicron Theta along with its human colonists. The destruction was so complete that not even soil bacteria survived. Data was in fact the only survivor because he is inorganic. He was also activated afterwards by Starfleet investigators, so he had no memory of the incident. Reverting back to Melona 4, Riker orders the present colonists to seek shelter in some nearby caverns. As they flee, he watches helplessly as his lover Carmen and an old man are vaporized and absorbed by the entity, who, to cite the script directly, quote, feeds on life and is, quote, insatiably ravenous for the life force found in living forms. Riker and most of the colonists survive and emerge from their cavern to find their former planet stripped bare. Picard then contacts Starfleet and informs them of his intentions to, quote, pursue and investigate the crystalline entity. Not destroy, just pursue and investigate. Starfleet beams aboard Dr. Keela Marr, a xenologist who has studied the creature for some time. She is anxious to interview the survivors since, in her words, they are, quote, the only known beings ever to survive an assault by the crystalline entity in 11 recorded attacks. She explains at a staff meeting that, quote, the crystalline entity seems to function like a gigantic electromagnetic collector. It needs a lot of power to keep going, so it strips every form of life from the worlds it encounters and converts it all into energy, unquote. It's rather nightmarish stuff, and one would assume that, sentient or not, it must be stopped. Throughout the episode, Dr. Marr repeatedly demonstrates biased feelings toward Data, since it was his brother Lore that led the creature to Omicron Theta, where her 16-year-old son was killed and absorbed. This is why she became an expert on the entity. She believes it entirely possible that Data could be in league with the creature as well. This was a perfectly reasonable assumption on her part, but the writers repeatedly render her as irrationally suspicious and compromised by grief. Eventually, she does warm up to Data, however, and together they formulate a method to track the crystalline entity. On an elevator ride from engineering to the bridge, Data explains to her that he has retained all of the colonists' memories from Omicron Theta, including those memories of her deceased son. Quote, the contents of their logs and journals were transferred into my memory cells. The man who created me also experimented with scanning the synaptic patterns of the colonists' temporal lobes and programming them into my neural nets, unquote. I mention all this because it becomes important later. She and Data arrive at the bridge and explain the situation to Picard, who agrees to lay in a pursuit course for the crystalline entity. Dr. Marr then informs Picard about the necessary modifications that will need to be made to the ship's weaponry in order to destroy the creature. Picard agrees to make the modifications, but insists that attacking the entity must be a last resort. This naturally takes the Doctor by surprise and prompts an understandable outburst. In response, Picard decides to settle the matter in private and asks her to join him in his ready room.
Why are we pursuing the entity if not to destroy it?
We're not hunters, Doctor, nor is it our role to exact revenge.
What do you propose? We track it down, greet it warmly, and ask it if it would mind terribly not ravaging any more planets?
I don't deny that it may be necessary to fire on it, but I look on that as a last resort.
Why? Why not just kill it?
I want to try to communicate with it.
To what end?
If we can determine what its needs are, we might find other sources to supply it.
Its needs are to slaughter people by the thousands. It is nothing but a giant killing machine.
Doctor, the sperm whale on Earth devours millions of cuttlefish as it roams the oceans. It is not evil, it is feeding. The same may be true of the entity.
That would be small comfort for those who have died to feed it. We're not talking about cuttlefish, we're talking about people.
I would argue that the crystalline entity has as much right to be here as we do.
I want to reiterate Picard's view here and put it into perspective. He believes that a genocidal monster that travels from planet to planet, consuming all life like a giant vacuum cleaner, has as much right to be here as we do. He literally places the same value on its life as he does the members of his own crew. The Doctor leaves the bridge and visits Data in his quarters, where she inquires about his methods to establish communication with the entity. Data explains that he is experimenting with, quote, vibrations in crystals by means of graviton pulses, unquote. This is odd, however, because in Data lore, Data's brother simply spoke directly to the entity. There was no need for some elaborate means of communication. Fans have commented on this, and no explanation has ever been given. The writers simply appear to have retconned the entity to service their agendas and aims in this episode. The Doctor then inquires about her son's memories. She feels guilt for having left him on the planet and is worried that he harbored resentment toward her. Data reassures her that there are no records or memories indicating that he had retained any such negative feelings. Back on the bridge, a transport vessel hails the Enterprise and requests immediate assistance because the crystalline entity is attacking them. The screams of the men can be heard over the comms until their voices abruptly go silent, indicating that everyone aboard has been killed and absorbed. The Enterprise sets in a course to the last known location of the vessel and confirms that there were no survivors. In a subsequent scene, Dr. Marr expresses how, when she heard the passengers screaming, she thought of her own son and wondered if he had cried out for her in his final moments. Riker then expresses concern to Picard that their aim should be to kill the creature outright.
It's already killed thousands. It will undoubtedly continue to kill unless we stop it. I don't want those deaths on my conscience.
Are you sure that that's it, number one? Or are you being influenced by personal feelings?
With all due respect, sir, I'm not a raw cadet. If we take time to try to communicate with this thing, we may lose our chance to destroy it.
Once again, Picard ignores the concerns and well-founded reasoning of those around him and insists on communication with the genocidal alien. The crew finally encounters the crystalline entity again, and they emit the modified graviton pulses to communicate with it. Unsurprisingly, given the episode's motif, the creature attempts to respond.
It's trying to communicate with us.
I believe so, sir. But it will take some time to decipher the patterns.
Then it's possible. Communication. Understanding.
Picard is eerily euphoric about this connection. In this moment, he has absolutely no concern for the destruction this thing has wrought, or the thousands of lives it's taken. This monster literally just devoured an entire vessel of human beings, and all Picard can do is derive a perverse sense of satisfaction from eliciting a reaction from it. But then the graviton pulses change, and the creature appears to be in distress. Everyone looks back at Dr. Marr, who apparently has altered the frequencies of the pulses to one that is continuous. Counselor Troy utters with notable concern that something is very wrong, Captain. Data informs everyone that the entity is beginning to resonate. Picard demands that Dr. Marr return to the previous intermittent pulses. She refuses, and turning to Data, who carries her son's memories, she proclaims, "It's for you, Rennie. I did it for you." The entity then begins to violently shake, and eventually it explodes, putting an end to its existence of otherworldly and nightmarish destruction. But of course, there's a deeper moral lesson to be imparted here. Picard is furious and orders Worf to escort the Doctor to her quarters. As she leaves, she says, "It will never hurt anyone again." Data then asks Picard if he can escort the Doctor to her quarters. Picard agrees. The Doctor then expresses to Data that as long as he lives, a part of her son, Rennie, will survive. She then asks Data for help. She says, as if speaking to her son, "Tell me that you understand, Rennie, that you know I did it for you because I love you, because I wanted to give you peace at last." Data, in a typical act of moral demagoguery, searches through Rennie's files and proclaims that no, Rennie would be upset with his mother's actions.
I do not find such a file in your son's journals, Doctor. However, from what I know of him, by his memories and his writing, I do not believe he would be happy. He was proud of your career as a scientist, and now you have destroyed that. You say you did it for him, but I do not believe he would have wanted that. Yes, I believe your son would be very sad now.
So in summary, Star Trek took the side of a genocidal alien that murdered thousands, maybe even millions of beings, in order to teach a moral lesson to the audience. That lesson appears to be that even if you're a distraught mother whose child has been murdered by aliens, the most immoral thing you could do is retaliate. All I can say here is that I find this preposterous, and anyone would be fortunate to have a mother like Dr. Marr. Picard should have been relieved of command and committed to a mental asylum. Again, Picard put his entire crew, alongside their families, including women and children, at risk to satiate his desire to communicate with a demonstrably hostile alien that had literally destroyed entire planets. Technically, as he states at one point, the Enterprise's shields can protect them, but it's all contrivance in service to the moral posturing. Let's also not forget that the entity was likely on its way to destroy yet another planet. Even if Picard had been able to communicate with the monster, what then? Was he going to explain via graviton pulses that the millions of cuttlefish it was eating had just as much right to be here as it had? Assuming the entity even accepted the premise, what exactly was it going to eat afterwards? The whole thing is a psychotic application of post-war equality doctrines. Whether intentional or not, what Star Trek taught Westerners is that the worst thing you can possibly do is retaliate against clear, aggressive actors. Instead, you should seek communication and understanding with them. Now, communication and understanding are noble aims, but so is defending your own and responding with force to clear and present dangers. Star Trek takes a reasonable idea to unreasonable extremes and has helped to create a psychological pathology of suicidal empathy.